I'm so thankful that we get to have this conversation with you, Elizabeth, this morning, diving into our theme. And so I thought I'd just kind of begin with kind of a really open question of like how rage, grief, and goodness, the kind of intersections or parts of those are showing up in your life right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Elaine, for that, Reverend Elaine, for that beautiful meditation and reading the ways that grief is showing up in folks' lives just has me resonating a lot in a lot of ways. Today, I'm thinking a lot about my grandmother who died from COVID in January. Um, I think about her a lot in general, but because we are trying to hold a memorial in October, but like so many things these days, we don't know if that will be possible. Um, and so there's a real tender grief there. And then there's also just like all of the ironies and hilarities of life. Um, and one of those is that I'm forever doing too many things on my computer and getting all these notifications. Maybe you're one of those people where it's always like, you don't have room on your computer, you need to delete things. This, like, your disk is full, your disk is full. And every time I go to like try to clean up my computer, the thing that's taking up the most space are these beautiful and also so tender videos from when my grandmother was dying of COVID and we were able to be with her over video. And there's just something about like those recordings are taking up so much space and I want them to take up space. I want them to be part of my life as we go from here. Um, and also, many of us know that loss involves all kinds of mundane and inane logistics that we never thought we would encounter, which in this moment for me is a lot of like, your disk is full because you don't want to delete beautiful videos of your dead grandmother singing songs from the Music Man. Um, so, and then I think the rage piece, many of us have lost so much that is connected to wider systems, whether that's losing jobs or losing years of school or losing loved ones to COVID or to climate chaos. And I know for me, there's a rage that comes from some sense that we could have done things differently, that we could have built a different world. And my grandmother actually got COVID like a couple days before she would have been vaccinated in the assisted living facility she was in. And I am a person who can get real worked up and really angry about injustice. And part of my journey has been to understand how that rage is actually part of my grieving and part of my love. That it comes from the love that I have for her, for the many things we've lost and people we've lost, for this world. And those all get to be intertwined. And I brought this piece of art from the artist Molly Costello that says, "Grief and love are sisters." And I think we could probably add another sister and say that grief and love and rage are sisters. That they're all coming together and weaving together, and that, at least for me, my grieving is always going to involve expressions of love and expressions of rage.
I'm playing with that metaphor a little bit that, rage, grief, and love are all sisters. I mean, not all sisters get along all of the time, right? There's a lot of tension and um, just exertion that happens when you're trying to deal with, dynamics in a family. And so, like, I'm wondering how you have found those different dynamics. Like, how do you get those sisters in a place where you can experience each of them for what they are?
Yeah, you know, we're also different, and I think a lot of this is about our own spiritual journeys to know ourselves. So I'm whoever put grief is suppressed in chat, solidarity. Like I'm a suppressor, I'm a number outer, I'm a let's just do the next thing, as is evidenced by the like your hard drive disk is always full. Um, and I think for me, a lot of it has been about like holding compassion for like that's part of how I am, and simultaneously giving space for other ways of being. So it's really powerful for me to do things in honor of people. Um, and today is the anniversary of a friend who died by suicide a year ago, and he had survived the immigration system in the US. He had been in immigration prison for a long time and had experienced very traumatic, horrific things. And we're doing a lot of organizing right now where I live around the jail that he was in and around trying to get folks released and free from that jail that hurt him so much. And I find a huge amount of power in that, in knowing that the emails that we're sending, the meetings we're having with elected officials, the protests that we'll be holding in a week, that those are acts of memory and love and honoring of him. And I also know that that is more of my rage sister, and that there gets to be space on the timeline that that emerges for the love and for the sadness that we don't get to have a different ending. We don't get to have a different chapter, for him. And I think another thing I think about is like time is such a mess. Like, what is time? And grief, as I think many of us have lived, is not linear. I saw someone talking about the waves that come, and sometimes things just need time. I think of I have an uncle who I never got to meet who died in the Vietnam War before my family came to the US. And I heard stories about him growing up, but it took me many years to ask my parents to tell me more stories about my uncle. And it took me even more time to get a photo of him to add to the altar that I have that has photos of people who are important to me who have died. And it took a long time for me to go to Vietnam and to spend some time thinking about where he might be because his body was not recovered in the war. And that was just the time that needed to happen. Like, there wasn't a way to make that, there wasn't a faster time, and it was right on time. So I guess time for the sisters that don't always get along, and honoring the practices and the ways of grieving that have worked for us and not judging ourselves. If we're the type of person who something horrific happens and we want to throw ourselves into work and make the next to-do list, and also making space for getting to choose a different way. A few years ago, I went on a little bit of a grief retreat because I've learned that part of me being an introvert is that I need to be alone to really feel deep, deep feeling. And it was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. And I spent some time with friends in the mountains in the Southwest. And I wrote a lot of letters that I never mailed, around this particular loss. And that was very powerful to me, partially because I was choosing a different way. And it was just the time for me to choose, like, okay, I'm used to numbing out. I'm used to keeping going. I'm going to experiment with a different way and choose to let that sister, the grief sister, have some more space.
Hmm. Could you speak more about that choice? Like, just how How did you know to make it? What did it feel like? Like what shifted in you as you chose that different way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there was a part of me that knew that things, I'm no physicist, but one of the things that gives me a lot of comfort is the idea that no matter is ever destroyed, ever created, that everything that lives and dies is still part of the world in some way, lives on in some way, in some decomposed atomic way, or in the ways that our lives are touched. Um, and I also have seen in my own life and in others' lives how when grief becomes calcified or cemented, or doesn't get to take up space, how then it can manifest in ways that can sometimes be hard or hurtful. And I think I had just this clarity that if I didn't give this some space, it couldn't process, it couldn't marinate. There's a Thich Nhat Hanh, I believe, essay or poem about how grief is a raw potato, but if you can grieve, then that potato cooks
Mhm.
and it can feed you and it can nurture you, but you can't eat a raw potato. And I think of this understanding of grief by Earl Grolman that says grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love, and the only cure for grief is to grieve. And I
Mhm.
think that those words, like the only cure for grief is to grieve, I was like, oh, it's not checking more email and joining more amazing groups doing social justice work. Oh, like maybe I should like try a different thing.
Mhm.
And um, it felt, to the question of how it felt kind of selfish, and it felt kind of like a risk. Like, oh, I'm really gonna like go away to Santa Fe and to stay with friends to grieve. Um, and uh, and side by side was like just this clear sense of like, oh, but the grief is gonna grieve itself somehow, and like it's gonna emerge. And what a gift to have the privilege and the space and the time to choose to give some space to be in the desert and to write letters and burn things and move my body outside.
That phrase from that quote, "The only cure to grief is grieving," and your kind of addendum that the grieving is going to happen no matter what, feels especially prescient for me as I think about all the ways in which I suppress or pretend that I don't need to grieve. Like I pretend, oh, I'm not close to that. Oh, that doesn't really affect me. I'm functioning. And then like I move through my time and I like realize that my my heart drive, if you will, is like full and I don't have any more space or capacity. And then I'm like shocked by my own need to grieve and realize that I've been doing it and coping in ways that I wouldn't have chosen if I would have had that conscious, like that capacity to be conscious and be like, oh yeah, I actually do need to grieve that. I guess I wonder like what does it mean to grieve? I mean, it seems like a really simple question of like, what does it mean to like, because there's such a finality of loss. Either the death of someone, the death of an idea, like the and a lot of the grief that I worked through in my teenage years was around like the grief of ideas of things that I thought were true but are no longer true or might never be true. Like what? So what does it mean to grieve those? What does it mean to grieve in general?
Yeah. Um, I feel like I asked this question to my therapist recently where I was like, but what does it mean? um, well, I I think Let's see. I'm thinking so many things. I mean, one thing I'll share that's been very useful to me is a framework that says that grief, there are tasks of grief, and that one of
Mm,
them is to accept the loss, to experience the pain of the loss. That's one that I am often resistant to. I usually just want to skip to adjusting to a new life
mhm,
without the loss, and then to reinvest in the new reality.
mm,
And I have found that very helpful as like a person who wants to like understand what is like happening in my brain and spirit and heart. Um, but I think I will also just say like I feel very committed to like we all get to grieve in very different ways, and some of us are going to grieve in ways that are very much about like being present with the loss and maybe look to society more traditional, like with prayer and song. And I grew up with this very strong tradition of building an altar and honoring death anniversaries and lighting incense on those anniversaries. And for others of us, we're grieving, and it may not look like quote unquote spiritual, or it may not look the way that society thinks grieving looks. So, just to say that, I think we only know for ourselves if we're moving through that acceptance, allowing us to ourselves to feel the pain of loss, adjusting to a new life with the loss as part of that life, and reinvestment in the new reality. Like that's something we kind of have to be in touch with ourselves enough to know. And I think being in community is also a huge way that I have learned like, oh, like people can be like, Elizabeth, you think you're grieving, but you're like super irritated that I forgot to buy almonds this week because I live with a community of other folks. And it's like irritability, resentment, frustration. Community can be so powerful for like reflecting back some of those things that help me look in the mirror and say like, oh, actually that's grief,
mm,
and it's coming out for me in those other ways.
mm. You've spoken about a lot of different practices that have helped you and helped other people in communities deal with grief and loss. Talk about altars, writing these letters, pilgrimage, even to places,
Mhm.
to be present to it, even if there isn't a specific place like you spoke about in your journey to Vietnam. I wonder what practices have helped you move through your own grief practice that might be helpful for others, especially I think if we as we deal with these griefs that like are hard to put a pin in. Like it's hard to put a pin in exactly the grief um, of climate crisis, to put a pin in the grief around the COVID mismanagement and all the death, especially if we don't have a specific, tangible, proximate connection to it, but it's this general sense of grief and pain at the world. So, what are some practices that have helped you kind of move to that place of being able to reinvest and kind of find the goodness in life rather than being stuck just in the pain or the avoidance of the pain?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really hard when the grief is ongoing. Like it's one
Mm,
thing like to lose someone or something in a way that feels like it has an ending, and then you can reinvest in that new reality. And you know, one of the blessings in a way of losing my grandmother this past year is we do get to as a family journey together in a pretty clear way. Like we get to remember her with stories and chicken wings because she loved chicken wings, and brown eyed Susans because she loved brown eyed Susans. And we get to tell the stories about her to younger members of our family. And we know that that's where we are.
mm,
And I think, you know, with climate and with many other things, we're still in it. You know, I think about this. have the honor of being in community with a lot of folks who are facing deportation and who are in prison, and it's not post-traumatic. Like, the trauma is now, the grief is now, and there's no sense of when it will end.
Mm.
Um, in terms of practices, I mean, you've named a few that have been very nourishing to me. I find practices that have some connection to my spiritual or familial ancestry to be particularly powerful. So, for me, having an altar, um, I will say one of the things I've noted over the past 18 months or 2 years is I have refused to print photos of the people who have died in the past 2 years, including my grandmother, and add them to my altar.
Mm.
I just, and I think that's also part of my like journey on grief, is to like know when maybe that's just not the time. Like, there's a
Mm.
resistance in me to that, and the time will come. Um, but I think for any of us, creating some sacred space where we can put, whether it's symbols, rocks or water or leaves or photos or um, even like drawings or words, where we can put in one place and hold in sacredness the things that are connected to losses, is very powerful. Anything that like makes tangible all of the mess of like
Mm.
rage and sadness and frustration and what if I had, and I should have gone to visit, and why was I why am I living through 2021? Like, anything that takes that and puts it somewhere, I find for me very powerful. So the letter writing, especially because often when we're trying to accept the loss or reinvest in the new reality, what we want to do is like say things to the person,
Mhm.
or we want to say to that, grove of trees that doesn't exist anymore, or to that town that I'm not going to go back to because it floods there all the time now. Like, we want to say things, and we can write letters or record audio messages that express those things. And also, just like we're not robots. Like, we're full humans, which can be sort of horrifying and also totally amazing. And so there's, for me, I have to also engage my body in different ways, which has sometimes means singing. For me, there's nothing like a good combo sing cry. That's like a really good way to just like release. But I love, that you brought up pilgrimage, because I think moving in some way, whether that's, driving a route or rolling a path or hiking a really big hike, or swimming a distance, uh, that allows our bodies to be in a journey as our spirits and minds are also in a journey.
Mm.
And I feel like that can really help us to not feel like, oh, my like mind and heart are over here full of grief for the political situation, but my body is like
In the
over
same place.
here stuck.